Roadways and automobiles dominate transit in the Tulsa metro area.
My name is Kyler. I'm an architecture student who's been living in Tulsa for my whole life.
Today, I am going to go from this downtown coffee shop
all the way across the city without using a car. Now, in theory, this should be doable because Tulsa does have a bus system. But first of all, does it work? And if not, what's wrong with it? And what can we do to fix it? We're going to be discussing all of these topics and more in today's video.
So, welcome to eryngo urbanism.
Most people I've talked to agree that cars should not be the only way to get around a city. But in Tulsa, that's kind of the reality. This bus trip is supposed to take about an hour and a half, but by car, 16 minutes.
If you live and work off of one route, it can work for you. If you're navigating all the way across the city, you're looking at 3 routes, maybe 4. And in a 2.5 to 4 hour trip. That's not sustainable. No one's going to keep a job that way. No one's going to take care of their kids that way.
Obviously, this is an issue. If you can't afford a car in a city like Tulsa, you're screwed. You want to walk to the grocery store? I dare you. It's really, really easy to point out this problem. And once you notice it, you start seeing it everywhere. And it's frustrating. But what can we do to fix it? I would argue 2 things: density and transit.
I guess this is the
bus stop.
There's a bench. Guess we're waiting. At least I got Jeff here to keep me company.
Where were we? Oh yeah, density and transit. Side note, when I say density, don't be too alarmed. For the most part, I'm not talking about skyscrapers. I tend to imagine 3 to 5 story buildings with street-facing shops and restaurants where most of the surrounding public spaces are dedicated to human habitation rather than cars. Now, one of the things that I hear a lot when I talk about public transit is our city just doesn't have the population or density needed to sustain a better public transit system. And yeah, unfortunately, this is kind of true. Don't get me wrong, we do have the population. 402,000 people in the city and over 1 million in the metro area. With that many people, you should absolutely have a functional transit system. But the low density of the city is allegedly what causes this disconnect. But the flip side of that problem is, we also don't have the transit systems to support those medium to high densities. It's essentially a paradox. You can't have one without the other. My suggestion is this: instead of building up density first to create congestion, and then later alleviate that congestion with public transit, we could and should improve the public transit system right now, which would increase land values around those transit lines, and in turn create an overwhelming demand for that higher density without creating a congestion problem in the first place. And actually, a plan similar to this is already in place here in Tulsa. More on that in just a second.
I think I have to wait for it to go all the way down and circle around, though. Bye, bus.
Yes, you are seeing that right. Yes, it has been nearly an hour.
So what exactly is Tulsa doing right now to stop the sprawl and improve walkability throughout the city?
I think public transit is the area where we've probably had the most positive direction lately. We got a bus rapid transit line put down Peoria. Paulina and I have been heavily involved in the planning for the next one that'll go on Route 66. We're trying to make sure that land use along those BRT lines is transit oriented, making sure buildings are designed in ways that engage the pedestrian realm, parking either on street, on the side, or behind a building, mixed use, public ground floor, upper floors may be more private.
Every person who rides the bus also walks a little, depending on how much you're willing to or how much you're able to. Biking and bus, man, I wish more people were more willing to do that. The weather's not nearly as much of a factor as what most people make it out to be, but you don't know that until you try it. And make sure that it gets into your routine. Riding your bike and bus, man, that makes our system. If people are willing to do that, we could, with our existing budget, we could make some big changes.
We're in a good spot now where our office is able to influence incentives.
And by incentivizing density and transit together, we start to chip away at that paradox I mentioned earlier.
Well, Jeff, I finished my book. There's still no bus.
Guys, the bus didn't stop here.
Why is there a bus stop?
That's the bus I'm supposed to be on. I've been here for over an hour, and that's my bus.
I think it's gone. I don't think I'm gonna catch up with it.
So did you miss that bus then?
So I missed that bus.
No,
so
that's
I just
rough.
walked down to Harvard.
I started to say, because that bus only came every 60 minutes, that means that one error mistake cost you an hour. If you were transferring to another route after you did successfully get on that bus, your trip could be easily 3 hours, which is just not feasible for most people.
So yeah, I opted to walk 2.5 miles rather than wait another hour for the next bus to come. Ironically, This street that I walk down, a segment of the historic US Route 66, will soon have a bus rapid transit line that runs down a major portion of it. But what does that mean, really? Well, in the context of Tulsa, a so-called rapid bus means that you have a 15-minute wait max at any bus stop. And these bus stops have improvements such as level boarding, ticket purchasing, and digital signage. In other cities, a BRT headway is more like 3 to 5 minutes instead of 15, thanks to things like dedicated bus lanes and signal priorities. These are 2 extra big improvements that I think we should be striving for here in Tulsa, especially along the existing Peoria line. But eventually we'd want to implement these on Route 66 as well.
So good.
Now, with all of those improvements, in the very near future, a car-free trip down this part of Route 66 should be a breeze.
So this is the bus stop. That's the sign right there. The only shade comes from this pole, and there's nowhere to sit. I might walk a little further down and try to find another bus stop. The bus is supposed to get here in 25 minutes. I don't really want to stand here that long, so I think I'm gonna keep walking. All right, this one at least has a bench, so I think this is the one. I don't know if I can trust this guy. So I'll be waiting here for like 20 minutes. This bus stop has an electronic clock, and it tells you how hot it is.
So how can we design a better bus system? Let's imagine the best case scenario, a theoretical bus system which serves the entirety of Tulsa and most of its directly adjacent suburbs.
Well, let's look at the features being implemented in Tulsa's BRT lines. Specifically, long, straight-shot routes, stops placed about every half mile, and a 15-minute headway between buses. Instead of treating this 15-minute headway as something revolutionary, what if we just adopted this level of service as the standard throughout the city, and created a grid of these long, straight, high-frequency routes throughout the city, allowing people to transfer anywhere that 2 lines intersect?
That's wonderful when it comes to transit, right? These streamlined routes, they're easy for people to use, they're more efficient from an operations level, and our city's very grid-based.
Let's also add in 2 loop-shaped routes to provide more closely concentrated service in the denser and more urbanized parts of the city. On top of that, for fun, let's throw in some passenger rail lines, aligned to the existing freight rail rights-of-way, with stops and transfers to bus lines about every mile.
I mean, I would also love to have rail in between like Tulsa and Broken Arrow. Rail's very expensive, and we could have a really awesome bus system for the price of a mile of rail.
Yeah, that should probably be its own video, shouldn't it? Let's focus on the buses.
In theory, under a system like this, regardless of where someone lives and where they want to go, they're looking at 2 buses max. They ride as far east as they need to, transfer to the northbound bus, and take that as far as they need to.
But if all of these routes are high frequency, even the transfers you do need to make should really be no big deal.
That's also just really expensive. A budget like this would be 10 times what our budget is. But the premise and the idea and the vision is very much there. I've sketched up many things very similar to what this is. So no, I think you're spot on.
I made a little spreadsheet and found out that if you give every route a 10 to 30 minute frequency, depending on the number of destinations along a route, you'd need around 360 buses to pull off the system.
Now, at first, I thought that was way too many. But the more I started to look into it, a 400 bus fleet is actually not that crazy for a city with Tulsa's population. Looking back at Italy, the city of Florence actually has a slightly smaller population than Tulsa. And Florence has nearly 500 buses in total. And that's not to mention that Tulsa has about 5 times the land area to cover. So by comparison, that 360 bus number actually sounds pretty reasonable.
We have like 62 buses in our fleet. Pre-pandemic, we had around 52 buses peak pull out. But hey, I love that's great transit service. There are creative things that we can do and be innovative and use new technologies, but also our operating budget is like the size of Little Rock, Arkansas. Like, twice the coverage area and 3 times the population to serve. I recently saw a street construction project that was pretty expensive, but I believe it was the cost of what our annual budget is for our agency. That's not just local funds. That's like what we do, federal everything. So yeah, we spend a lot more on street construction and reconstruction than we do public transit. So there are some realities that we've got to overcome.
Now, I'm not going to get too deep into how much this system would actually cost, partially because I'm not an expert. By my best guess, it could be about $269 billion per year, which sounds like a lot, but in reality, we could come up with that if each City of Tulsa resident contributed $1.83 per day. And when you take into consideration that some of that money can be made back through fares and by renting out advertising space on buses and at stations, the system could potentially almost pay for itself.
Also, let's not forget that you're paying $1.37 per mile to drive a car. So if everyone took this bus system across the city once or twice a week instead of driving, we're already saving money.
But no matter how much it ends up costing, a great public transit system is a proven way to boost a local economy. According to the American Public Transit Association, every dollar invested in public transportation projects generates from $4 to $9 in local economic activity. A good public transit system is sometimes referred to as a wealth multiplier. So committing to build a system like this would absolutely be worth any price tag.
So this is something that's beautiful. That's really awesome. What I really want most Tulsans to know, that doesn't have to be the goal to really make life-changing improvements for bus riders in Tulsa. People that rely on the system, we don't have to have that. We can still make some major improvements that really change people's stations. And I wish people understood that. Even if we added another $6-7 million to our budget, if we added another 3 or 4, it's really not that much in the context of how all the flow of money. Making transit more feasible, not outstanding, just making it more feasible for the average Tulsan. It has pretty profound impacts.
Sadly, at the moment, we don't have an infinite budget for public transit.
It's a very finite resource that you can spread it out by time. You can run a service 24 hours a day. You can spread it out by coverage, right? You can cover the entire city or more. Or you can look at frequencies, like how often your buses come. So one of the things we are challenging, like we're trying to look at, well, maybe we do have fewer routes, but the routes that we have are pretty frequent, they're reliable, and if we figure out more ways to get people to those frequent routes, we're partnering with things like bike share and scooters and Uber and Lyft so that you can streamline how people pay for stuff and funnel people to transit. Maybe there are areas that have low ridership, they're hard to serve with the big bus. But because of its low ridership, maybe it makes more sense to have an Uber type vehicle that's on demand that can serve people in that area and connect them to other places.
Okay, so maybe Chase is right, and Tulsa just isn't ready for a world-class transit system. As I was mulling over everything he told me about, I put together a sketch of the kind of system I think we're headed towards, which actually looks surprisingly cool and functional. I started by drawing the backbone BRT lines, and from there, I started just drawing a line that kind of crisscrossed throughout the city, tracing long stretches of streets spaced about every 2 miles. Once I formed a loop, I did it again to fill in some of the streets I missed in the more dense areas, and then I repeated the process one more time to make some of the suburban connections to the BRT routes. I allowed these suburban buses especially to hop on highways for long stretches with no stops. These are represented by dotted lines. What you end up with is 2 primary frequent bus routes which meet downtown with 3 feeder lines that can bring people from all different parts of the city to these main services. And then you can imagine filling in some of the gaps between routes with improved cycling infrastructure. And since this layout reduces the mileage significantly from the current system routes, you should actually be able to get pretty decent frequency if the full existing 62 bus fleet were to be deployed.
How hot is it? Oh, 79 now. We finally made it.
21st D Harbor.
We're on a bus.
Alright, so you might be wondering, how was my experience on the bus itself? Well, from the moment I got on the bus to the moment I got off, honestly, everything was fantastic. As it turns out, they've waived fares through the end of the month, so my ride was free. The bus was air conditioned, which was a nice change from... It was also roomy and clean, partially because I was the only person on the bus for most of the trip. There were 2 other people who hopped on and off for about a mile, and as it turns out, I wasn't the only one trying out the bus today for the first time.
It's my first time ever riding a bus.
I highly recommend trying out transit in your city if you haven't before. Make sure you clear your schedule and do some planning ahead of time, but really it's a great way to see your city from a new perspective. And if it works out, maybe you can even make it a part of your daily routine. For me, the main issue was getting to the right stop at the right time in order to actually catch the bus I needed to get on. If I took this route again tomorrow, I could account for those mistakes and basically cut the travel time in half.
Thank you, you too. So, we finally made it. What did we learn?
So Tulsa is like one of the most giving cities, right? So we have tons of nonprofits here. We do a lot of really outstanding work. People in Tulsa care about their neighbors. One thing about Tulsans outside of that is that we live in Oklahoma. We live in a very car-centric area that's largely developed after World War II, which means the explosion of automobiles, and that's just kind of what our city is built around. And I think a lot of people recognize that. They don't recognize how different and how difficult someone's life is if they are forced to ride a bus system that is kind of similar to what we have in Tulsa, actually, like our reality, right? It stinks. There's a cool project in Oklahoma City right now about reunification for parents who have their kids in the foster system. They've lost them. There's all kinds of social implications and things like that that we're spending lots of money and time and resources into. That a huge factor is mobility, which is a very real problem that was identified with that effort, and that's something they're changing right now. Transportation is a big factor that most people don't think about, and I wish we could connect the dots between the heart for their neighbors, right? The heart for caring for people in need. I wish people understood that transportation was a much bigger avenue to accomplish a lot of those same goals.
But I also want to stress that a good bus system is more than just charity. It could and should be a decent option for people like me who are just trying to get around and don't really care for driving. This trip took me nearly 3 hours to get across the city by bus. In this time, I could have driven the same route 11 times or just straight up walked the whole way. And that's not to mention that most of this time was me just sitting in the sun. It felt insulting. If this trip had taken just twice as long as a car ride would have taken, I could see myself doing that on a regular basis. If it was faster than taking a car, I could see most people doing it on a regular basis. Now, if you want to see changes like this in your city, you're gonna have to make your voice heard. Contact the city councilor for your district. Start a YouTube channel about it. And when we make it happen, I will be back to take this trip again and show you just how much has improved. But until then, make sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Also, feel free to join my Discord, and if you're feeling generous, support me on Patreon. I'd love to give a special thank you to my first patron, John Somdasurf, who will be receiving this really cool mug I designed.
Why does it say cars suck? What's wrong with cars, you ask? Click this video to find out.